The scratching at the door. The rain had been falling for 3 days without mercy. Not the gentle, forgiving kind of rain that washes the world clean and makes the fields smell sweet. This was mountain rain, cold and relentless and deeply indifferent to the suffering of anything that happened to be caught beneath it. It came down in heavy curtains that turned the dirt paths into rivers, and the rivers into something that no longer remembered it had ever been a river. It drummed against the roof of Darren Moss's cabin with the kind of persistence that made a man feel personally targeted, as though the sky had reviewed his life and decided he deserved exactly this. Darren didn't mind it. He'd slept in worse, he'd marched through worse. He'd pressed his back against the crumbling stone of a watchtower in the Keithran Pass with 5 men and a broken shield wall and a storm so violent that the lightning had lit up the enemy's faces like painted masks, and he'd held that position until morning because there had been nothing else to do. Rain was rain. It was honest, at least. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. He sat at his table near the single window of the cabin, the wooden shutter cracked open just enough to let in a breath of cold air and the sound of the downpour. The stew pot was on the hook over the fire, and the smell of it filled the small room. Venison, what was left of it, with dried herbs and the last of the root vegetables he'd pulled from the cold box before the storm settled in. The fire was good. The chair was familiar in the way that only chairs belonging to solitary men ever become, shaped not just to a body but to a particular way of sitting in silence. The bowl in front of him was warm against his palms. Sergeant Darren Moss, formerly of the Vithran Iron Company, formerly of the King's Third Expeditionary Force, formerly of a dozen numbered engagements that all blurred together now into a general impression of mud and blood, and the sounds men make when they are no longer men but simply bodies deciding whether to stay or go. Darren Moss had been retired for 4 years, and on most evenings retirement suited him. He was 51 years old. He looked older by a decade, the way men do when they've spent their lives outdoors and under pressure. His face had the texture of well-used leather, the lines carved deep by sun and cold, and the particular tension of keeping expressions controlled when expression was a liability. His hair had gone from brown to gray to something approaching the color of old iron. His hands were large and scarred and absolutely still when he wasn't using them. The hands of a man who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement was wasted energy. The bad knee ached in the cold, it always did. He'd stopped paying it much attention. He'd built this cabin himself 3 years ago after spending the first year of his retirement in a town called Asheville at the base of the mountains, discovering with quiet certainty that towns and he were no longer compatible. Not because he was broken, he'd met broken men, knew what they looked like, knew the particular vacancy behind their eyes, but because the constant proximity of people who had not seen what he had seen created a friction he couldn't smooth away. They talked too much about things that didn't matter and too little about things that did. Their silences were uncomfortable. His silences were the only company he actually trusted. So he'd gone up the mountain, far enough to be alone, close enough that the trading post at Asheville was a half-day's walk when he needed supplies. He'd felled the trees himself, shaped the logs himself, built the walls and the roof and the stone chimney with the methodical patience of a man who had nothing but time and a preference for doing things right. He'd planted a small garden that the deer mostly ate. He kept chickens in a coop around the back that the foxes kept trying to dismantle. He hunted, preserved, repaired, and lived with the efficient minimalism of a soldier who'd spent 2 decades operating on the principle that everything you carried had to be worth its weight. He did not miss the war. He missed, occasionally and with some guilt, the clarity of it, the way every problem resolved itself into the simplest possible terms, the way the question of what mattered answered itself automatically when the alternative was dying. But the war itself, the politics of it, the waste of it, the king's face that he'd seen exactly twice and both times from a distance, that he did not miss at all. 4 years of silence had suited him. Until the scratching. He heard it between one spoonful and the next. He wasn't a man who questioned his instincts. 20 years had sharpened them past the point of doubt. So when something registered, even something faint, even something that might have been the wind finding a gap in the shutter, even something nearly swallowed by 3 days of constant rain, his spoon simply stopped moving and he was still. The fire crackled, the rain hammered, the stew pot made its quiet internal sounds. And then it came again. A sound from the door, low, faint, the kind of sound that had no aggression in it. Not a knock was a deliberate thing, a human social ritual, a declaration of intent. This was something closer to what happened when intention had been exhausted and only the last thin thread of physical impulse remained. A dragging, a pressing, something soft and desperate and small against the hard wood of his door, scrape, 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 and then silence, and then again. Darren set down his spoon. His right hand moved to the axe hanging on the peg beside the hearth, not because he decided to use it, because the hand was more experienced than the rest of him and had its own opinions about preparation. His fingers wrapped around the haft with the ease of 10,000 repetitions, and he crossed the cabin floor in 4 quiet steps, bad knee ignored, the way he'd learned to ignore it in moments that required more than his body felt like giving. He stopped at the door, listened. The scraping again, weaker this time, and beneath it, barely audible beneath the rain, something else. Something that broke against his chest with a dull, unexpected force. A sound of exhaustion so profound it had passed through suffering and come out the other side into something quiet and almost peaceful. Not a scream, not a howl. A small, involuntary sound, the kind that comes from a creature that has stopped performing its pain for any audience and is simply privately running out. He lifted the latch. He pulled the door open into the storm. The cold air hit him first, then the rain, a cold mist of it blowing in sideways under the overhang of the porch roof. Then the smell, wet earth and something else, something mineral and strange, like lightning that had already struck and left its charge in the air. And then he looked down. It was small. That was the first thing his soldier's mind registered before it registered anything else. An assessment of scale, of threat level, of dimensions, small. Much smaller than anything he'd expected, which itself told him nothing because he hadn't known what he was expecting. His mind had run through the possibilities in the half-second between the door and the opening. Injured animal, lost traveler, something predatory using the sound of weakness as bait. This was none of those things. This was a dragon. Or rather, what would become a dragon if it survived the next few hours? Right now it was barely a suggestion of what a dragon was supposed to be. It lay on the wooden boards of his porch in a heap of itself, wings folded so tightly against its body that they might have been painted there, limbs drawn close, tail curled around everything else in the automatic protective instinct of something that had been cold for a very long time. The scales should have been beautiful. He could tell that even now, even in the dim light from the cabin spilling out into the wet dark. They were the color of storm clouds when the storm is still deciding what it wants to do, that deep shifting gray with hints of blue-silver underneath, the kind of color that would catch light spectacularly under a clear sky. Right now they were dulls. That was the word for it. He'd seen iron go dull. He'd seen eyes go dull. The brilliance that was supposed to be there, the living reflective quality of healthy scales, had been leached away by hunger and cold and exposure until what remained was flat, matte, the color of ashes. The body beneath them was wrong, too angular, too defined in the wrong ways. He could see the architecture of the ribs through the scales, each one a separate raised line, the spaces between them concave. The spine was visible, a ridge of small interlocking plates running from neck to tail, each vertebra distinct where it should have been cushioned by muscle and flesh. The wings, folded as they were, looked like cloth that had been stretched over sticks, the membrane translucent in places, the supporting bones pressing visibly against the fragile skin. The creature was starving. Not recently hungry, not skipped a few meals hungry. The kind of starvation that hollows a body out systematically, that makes decisions about which systems to sacrifice in order to keep the essential ones running, that leaves its marks in ways that take more than a meal or two to undo. He'd seen this before. Not in dragons, he'd never seen a dragon this close, not a living one, but in men, in refugees, in prisoners brought out of places where food had been a form of punishment. He knew what this looked like. The eyes were what stopped him entirely. They were open, barely. The lids were heavy, trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining even that much, and the eyes beneath them were pale gold, the gold of embers that have burned down past their best hours and are running on the last of their heat. They found him in the dim light with a focus that should not have been possible from a body in this condition, and they held. No aggression. He scanned for it automatically, the reflex of a man who had learned to read threat in a quarter-second and found nothing. No tension in the jaw, no ridge of warning scales along the neck, no positioning of the body toward attack. Everything that the body language of a predator should have contained was absent, replaced by something so plainly opposite that it took his brain a moment to name it properly. Supplication. He knew this look. He had worn this look once a very long time ago in a ditch in the Feldmere campaign with a broken collarbone and 2 inches of water rising around him, when the sound of his own company's footsteps had come through the mud and he'd looked up at the silhouette of a man he didn't know and communicated with his entire body the one thing he needed that person to understand. I cannot fix this myself. I am not asking for anything grand. I am asking not to die here. The dragon on his porch was asking the same thing. Its small clawed foot lifted from the boards, barely, perhaps an inch, and then fell back down with a sound like a whispered surrender. Darren stood in the doorway of his cabin, with the rain coming down behind the dragon and the warmth of his fire pressing against his back and his axe in his right hand, and he looked at this creature for 4 seconds. He counted them, old habits. Then he stepped back from the door, opening it wider, and said simply, "Come in." The dragon couldn't stand. He registered this in the same moment he said it. as the creature attempted to respond to the invitation, and its legs failed to carry the weight of even this ruined version of itself. It made it to its feet, all four of them briefly, the effort visible in the way every line of its small body tensed at once. And then the front legs buckled, and it went down to its elbows on the porch boards with a sound that was both physically quiet and somehow enormous. Darren was not a man who deliberated in moments that required action. He set the axe down against the doorframe, stepped out onto the porch into the cold rain, and crouched down beside the creature. Up close, the smell of it was stronger, that mineral lightning charge quality, and beneath it something that reminded him strangely of the mountains themselves, of high cold air and stone after rainfall. He was aware, in the detached, analytical corner of his mind that never fully switched off, that he was crouching beside a dragon with no weapon in his hands. He was aware that adult dragons were among the most dangerous living things on the continent, that the histories he'd half paid attention to during his army education spoke of villages burned, and armies rooted, and fortresses rendered to slag. He was also aware that this dragon right now could not stand up. He slid one arm under the creature's chest and the other under its hindquarters and lifted. It weighed almost nothing. That was the thing that hit him hardest, harder than the cold or the rain or the strangeness of the moment, the weight of it. He'd expected some residual solidity, some density of bone and scale that suggested what the creature was supposed to be. Instead, he got the weight of something wrong. Something that told him immediately and without ambiguity that they were operating on a very narrow margin here. That the difference between this creature surviving and not surviving was a matter of hours, maybe less. He carried it inside and kicked the door shut behind him with his heel. He didn't put it on the table. The table was where he ate and worked, and it was practical and clear, and no part of him suggested the table. He went to the corner nearest the stove, the warmest part of the cabin, where the flagstone floor held the heat from the fire better than anywhere else. He had a folded wool blanket on the arm of his chair, old, thick, the kind that came from mountain sheep and had been washed enough times to go soft, and he took it with 2 fingers while still holding the dragon in his other arm, shook it out one-handed with the efficiency of long practice, and folded it twice into a rough square that he set on the floor close to the stove without getting close enough to risk overheating a body this depleted. He set the dragon down on it. It settled without resistance. No hissing, no snapping, no last reserve display of warning. The wings remained folded, the legs drew inward, and the pale gold eyes tracked him from the moment he set it down to the moment he straightened, never losing him even as they continued to struggle to stay open. Darren stood over it and thought in the rapid, sequential, no-nonsense way he'd always thought when presented with a problem that needed solving rather than analyzing. He wasn't a healer. He wasn't a scholar of draconic biology. He had no reference point for what a creature like this needed beyond the general principles he'd applied to men in the field, and men were not dragons. The metabolism was different. The physiology was different. The risks were different. But the fundamentals, he suspected, were not. Cold was bad. He'd addressed the cold. The stove was 2 feet away, and already he could see, or believed he could see, the faintest change in the quality of the shivering, still present, still deep, but perhaps marginally less violent than it had been on the porch. That was something. Warmth first, that was one. He went to the fire and pulled the stew pot hook aside. Too rich, too heavy, the venison stew was exactly wrong for a system this compromised. He'd seen men ruined by well-meaning companions who'd given them a full meal after starvation, the stomach in revolt, the body overwhelmed by what it was supposed to want. He needed broth. Simple, clear, warm broth. He had a secondary pot he used for exactly this kind of reduction, and he filled it with water from the covered bucket near the door, added what remained of the dried herbs and a knuckle of preserved bone from the cold box, and set it over the fire. The dragon's eyes followed him the entire time. He moved around his cabin collecting things with the calm efficiency of a man who had always known where everything was because chaos was a luxury he'd never been able to afford. A second wooden bowl, the smaller one, better sized. A cloth he kept for straining liquid. The low stool that he sometimes used when working at the fire so he could sit near the creature without looming over it, without presenting himself as a standing threat. He pulled the stool over and sat. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He wasn't certain it understood him. Dragon intelligence was a subject about which he knew almost nothing beyond the general reputation, and this one was very young enough that the timeline of when a dragon developed language was beyond his knowledge. But he'd always believed that tone carried more than words, that the architecture of a voice communicated something regardless of the specific content. He kept his voice low and level, the voice he'd used with frightened horses and frightened young soldiers who were experiencing their first engagement, the voice that said, "I am not in a panic, and therefore you should not panic either. You're cold and you're hungry and you came to the right place for both of those things," he continued in the same tone. "The broth will take a while, you're going to have to stay awake." The pale gold eyes held on his face. He reached over without rushing and adjusted the edge of the wool blanket that had come loose from beneath one wing, tucking it back against the creature's side. The contact was brief and deliberate. He'd learned a long time ago that touch without warning was an act of aggression, and touch with too much ceremony was an act of performance. The right kind of touch was practical, purposeful, and quick. I am doing a specific thing, not displaying power over you, not making a statement, and the dragon's body received it without flinching. The shivering continued, but the creature's eyes didn't change from whatever they were doing, which Darren had begun to tentatively categorize as watching him with exhausted and desperate attention, the way a person watches the only thing standing between them and the dark. He settled back on the stool. The fire worked, the rain continued. The broth began its slow progression toward ready. Darren Moss, who had not spoken more than 20 words to another living thing in the past 3 weeks, who had come to this mountain expressly to be alone with his silence and his functional regrets, sat beside a dying baby dragon on a folded wool blanket and watched it breathe with the careful, unsentimental attention of a man who had decided a thing was going to live and was now simply making that happen. Outside, the storm had no opinion about this. The cabin, for its part, was warm, and the pale gold eyes had not closed. Warmth and hard breads. The broth was ready in 40 minutes. Darren knew this not because he was watching the pot. He'd learned decades ago that watching a pot was a waste of attention that could be directed at something useful, but because he'd made enough field broth in enough bad conditions to know the sound it made when it crossed from heating to ready. A particular quality of simmer. A change in the way the steam moved. Small things that registered in the peripheral awareness of a man who had trained himself to monitor his environment continuously without being consumed by it. He'd spent the 40 minutes doing what he always did when he had time and a problem, thinking without forcing it. He'd studied the dragon with the same methodical patience he'd once used to study terrain before an engagement. Not starring was aggressive, starring was a challenge, and the creature needed no more challenges tonight but watching with the unfocused peripheral attention that gathered information without demanding it. The breathing, which had been shallow and too fast when he'd first brought it inside, was slowing incrementally. That was good. The shivering, deep and systemic, had reduced from full-body tremors to something more localized, concentrated now mostly in the haunches and the base of the wings. Also good. The scales, still dull, had taken on the faintest suggestion of warmth at the edges closest to the stove, a subtle shift in color that was barely visible but present. The body was trying. The eyes had stayed open. That, more than anything, had kept Darren calibrated toward cautious optimism rather than the darker calculation he'd briefly entertained when he first felt the creature's weight or the absence of it in his arms. Consciousness was not the same as survivability, but it was a prerequisite, and the pale gold eyes had tracked him with a focus that spoke of something still present and still fighting even if every other system was running on fumes. He'd seen men with that look. Some of them had made it. He got up from the stool, strained the broth through the cloth into the smaller wooden bowl, and crouched beside the blanket. "This is going to be warm," he said in that same low-level voice. "Not hot, I want you to drink it slow." He set the bowl on the flagstone within reach, close enough that the creature didn't need to move significantly to access it. Then he stayed where he was, crouched, elbows on his knees, neither pushing nor retreating, offering without demanding. He'd fed a lot of things in his life, men who were too proud to accept help, men who were too broken to ask for it, frightened animals that needed time to understand that the hand extended toward them was not a threat. The approach was the same in all cases. You made the thing available. You gave the creature its own decision about the timing. You didn't perform generosity in a way that required gratitude before it had been earned. The dragon looked at the bowls. Looked at him. Looked at the bowl again. Then, with the slow and monumental effort of something that had very little left to spend, it uncurled its neck and lowered its head toward the broth. The first contact, the tip of its snout touching the surface of the liquid, produced a pause. Darren watched the nostrils flare, processing, tasting the air above it. Then it drank. Carefully at first, in small increments, as though each swallow required a separate decision. Then with more commitment as the warmth hit whatever system received it first and sent back a signal that yes, this was good, this was what was needed. Darren didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything to interrupt the moment. When the bowl was empty, the dragon raised its head and looked at him again with those pale gold eyes, and Darren took the bowl back to the pot and refilled it without comment, without ceremony, as though this were simply the next step in a routine he'd been doing for years. The second bowl went the same way as the first, a little faster. The third bowl the dragon drank half of and then stopped. He didn't push. He took the bowl away, set it near the pot, and returned to his stool. A system that had been running on empty for this long didn't need to be overwhelmed on the first night. Half a bowl in stopping was better than a full bowl and a system in revolt. He filed this away alongside the other data points he'd been collecting and sat with the updated picture of where things stood. Warmer, less shivering, 3 half portions of broth distributed across an hour, eyes still open, breathing approaching something less alarming. Darren decided quietly and privately that the creature was probably going to live. He ate his own dinner cold. The stew had been sitting since before all this began, and he ate it the way he'd eaten countless cold meals, without complaint and without much attention, refueling the body because the body required it, tasting none of it. His attention was divided between the bowl in his hands and the creature near the stove, monitoring without hovering, checking without making the checking into something the dragon needed to perform for. After he'd eaten, he washed the bowl and the pot at the small basin, set them to dry, and banked the fire to burn long rather than hot. The cabin held heat well. He'd built it to hold heat well, because the mountains were not forgiving about poorly insulated walls, and he'd spent too many nights cold enough to make the choice philosophically. And with the stove banked properly, the temperature would stay stable through the night without waking up to add wood. He added a log anyway, one extra, then he went to his chair. He didn't sleep, not immediately. He sat with his legs stretched toward the warmth and his hands loose in his lap, which was his version of rest, and he let his thoughts do what thoughts do when they're not directed: move around, look at things from the sides, ask questions without urgency. The dragon shifted on the blanket. Not dramatically, just a small resettling, the kind of unconscious adjustment a sleeping body makes when it's looking for a position that costs less effort to maintain. The wings, which had been clamped tight all evening, relaxed fractionally, the left one drooping slightly away from the body. The tail, curled tight around everything, loosened a single coil. Relaxation. Actual physiological relaxation. Not unconsciousness, not the false stillness of a body too depleted to maintain tension, but the genuine loosening of a system that had decided, at some deep and inarticulate level, that it was safe enough to stop bracing. Darren observed this and felt something shift slightly behind his sternum, a sensation he'd felt before and had various names for depending on the context. Tonight he didn't try to name it. He let it sit there and returned to looking at the fire. He thought about the question of what it was doing here, alone in a mountain storm in November. Dragons were not solitary creatures in their early years. Every piece of knowledge he'd accumulated about them, sparse as it was, agreed on this. They were clutch animals. They were raised communally. A dragon this young, this small, had no business being alone on the eastern face of the Asheville Range with 3 days of storm on top of whatever had preceded it. Something had happened. Something had separated this creature from whatever it was supposed to belong to. He didn't push at this question. It would answer itself or it wouldn't, and either way his job tonight was the same. The fire talked quietly to itself. The rain was finally, tentatively, beginning to ease. Sometime after the first hour of sitting, Darren Moss fell asleep in his chair the way old soldiers fall asleep, completely, efficiently, and with one ear still in the room. He was awake before dawn. The cabin was dim, the fire burned low, the quality of silence telling him the rain had stopped in the night. The cold that came through the gap in the shutter had the particular sharp edge of post-storm mountain air, that cleaned-out feeling like the world had been scraped down to its elements. He was aware, before he opened his eyes fully, that something in the room was different from when he'd fallen asleep. He opened his eyes. The dragon was sitting up. Not standing, the legs were still folded beneath it, the posture close to what a resting cat achieves when it wants to be upright without committing to full wakefulness. But the head was raised, the neck extended, and the pale gold eyes were fixed on him with an alertness that had not been there the night before. The quality of the gaze had changed overnight in a way he found difficult to articulate precisely. The previous evening it had been the gaze of a creature looking at the only thing standing between it and ceasing to exist, desperate, focused, stripped of everything but the immediate need. This morning it was something more considered, more present. The eyes of a creature that was reassembling itself and taking stock of its surroundings with faculties that had been unavailable when survival had consumed all available resources. It was, Darren realized, actually looking at him, not through him or at the concept of him, at him specifically. He held the gaze for a moment, then stood from his chair and went to rebuild the fire. "You're sitting up," he said, which was not a question or an expression of surprise, simply an acknowledgement delivered in the even tone of a man who considered acknowledgement important. The dragon watched him add wood to the coals, watched him use the small bellows to encourage the fire back to something productive, watched him fill the pot and reheat yesterday's broth, which he'd covered and kept near the stove overnight. It said nothing, but it watched everything with that new quality of attention, the attention of a mind doing work. The second day was different from the first in the way that a situation changes when the immediate crisis has passed. and the longer reality of things becomes visible. The dragon ate, that was the central fact around which everything else organized itself. Not enthusiastically, this was not a creature that had recovered enough for enthusiasm, but consistently and with increasing confidence. Broth again in the morning, and this time the dragon finished 2 full bowls and held out with a small and somewhat imperious extension of its neck for a third. Darren provided the third without comment. In the afternoon, he cooked the rest of the dried venison down into something tender enough that he could pull it apart with his fingers, and he set a portion on the flagstone near the blanket, and he watched with a certain private satisfaction as the dragon ate it carefully and completely, picking up each piece with a precision that seemed too deliberate for a creature that had been near catatonic the previous evening. The body, given what it needed, was making remarkable progress. He began to identify things about the creature that the emergency of the first night hadn't allowed for. The scales, responding to warmth and food and hydration, were returning to their proper quality. He could see it most clearly along the neck and the top of the skull, where the storm gray was brightening towards something more alive, the blue-silver undertone becoming visible again. The wings, which had spent all of the previous night clamped tight, were occasionally stretching now brief unconscious expansions that the dragon seemed barely aware of, the way a person stretches their shoulders without deciding to. The ribs were still visible. The spine was still too prominent. But the angles were softening incrementally, the body beginning to fill in the places that hunger had carved out. Small claws, he noticed. Neat and sharp and darker than the scales, more charcoal than gray. They sat precisely against the flagstone when the dragon was at rest, and when it moved they were placed with the automatic care of something that had grown up understanding that claws were specific tools and should be treated accordingly. The tail was expressive in ways that the face was not yet, or perhaps the face was expressive in ways he didn't yet have the vocabulary to read. The tail moved in slow, thoughtful arcs when the dragon was processing something, tightened when it was uncertain, stilled completely when it was focused. He watched these things the way he'd always watched things. Cataloging, building a picture. Not for any strategic purpose, there was no strategy here, no angle, no advantage to be calculated, but because attention was how he understood the world and understanding was how he respected it. On the morning of the second day, he baked bread. This was not unusual. He baked bread every few days, a dense dark loaf using the sourdough culture he'd maintained for 3 years in a crock near the stove, because bread kept well and was useful in too many ways to count, and because the act of making it was one of the few genuinely peaceful things he'd carried intact from his previous life into this one. His mother had made bread. He'd watched her do it as a child and filed it away in the place where useful things went, and when he'd finally had a kitchen of his own, he'd taught himself from the memory of watching her, making mistakes and correcting them until the result was something he wasn't embarrassed by. He mixed the dough at his table, and he was aware the entire time of the pale gold gaze tracking his hands. The dragon had moved during the night, not far, perhaps 2 feet, but of its own initiative, repositioning on the blanket so that it faced the table rather than the stove, which meant it had been awake at some point and made a conscious decision about orientation. He'd noted this without remarking on it. The creature's mobility was its own business. He wasn't keeping it, he wasn't a zookeeper. He was a man who had let something cold and starving in out of the rain, and was now feeding it until it could leave under its own power. And everything between those 2 points was the dragon's to manage. He turned the dough, shaped it, set it near the stove to prove. He tore off a piece of the previous loaf, 2 days old now, harder than ideal but not inedible, and set it on the flagstone near the dragon while he was passing. The dragon looked at the bread. Looked at him. Back at the bread. It ate it with careful deliberation, the way it seemed to do most things, biting a small piece free, processing it, deciding something positive, and continuing. Darren turned back to his other work. He heard the quiet sounds of the bread being consumed piece by piece behind him and said nothing about it. He'd been feeding things for a long time, men, animals, the occasional circumstance. He'd never found it required commentary. It spoke in the afternoon. He was at the window, the shutter open now that the storm had cleared, looking out at the mountain face and the line of trees below and the sky above them, which had gone from 3 days of violent gray to an almost aggressive blue, the kind of blue that follows bad weather as though the sky is overcompensating. The light was cold and clear and very precise, the way mountain light is when there's no moisture left in the air to soften it. He heard a sound behind him that was not a shuffle or a movement, or the particular noise of a creature repositioning itself on a wool blanket. It was a word. Rough, too large for the body it came from, as though the voice had been calibrated for a throat 10 years in the future and was currently being squeezed through something not yet built to handle it. Crackling at the edges with a resonance that was more physical sensation than sound, a vibration he felt as much as heard, but a word. unmistakably, structurally, intentionally a word. Why? Darren turned from the window. The dragon was fully upright, not standing still on the blanket, still in the resting position, but the head was raised and the neck was straight and the pale gold eyes were on him with a directness that had nothing of the previous night's desperation in it. This was a question from a mind that had stabilized enough to want answers. To demand them in the quiet way of a creature that wasn't entirely certain it had the right to demand anything but was asking regardless. Why what? Darren said. A pause, the tail moved in a slow arc, processing. Why help? Another pause. The words were effortful, he could see that, each one requiring more work than it should, the way a person speaks in a second language they've learned young but haven't used in some time. I am dragon, you are human, you had axe. Darren held the gold gaze. I had axe, he agreed. Then why? He moved away from the window and went to his chair, sat down. The question deserved sitting down for, not because it was complicated but because it was real, and real questions deserved the courtesy of not being answered standing up as though they were simple. He looked at the dragon for a long moment, not stalling. He already knew the answer, but taking the measure of how to give it in a way that communicated what he actually meant rather than what sounded good. He reached past the dragon without rushing, the pale gold eyes tracking his arm with new watchfulness, present but not alarmed, and broke a piece from the remaining bread on the flagstone, set a piece on the hearthstone within the creature's reach, kept a piece in his own hand, leaned back. Because you knocked, he said, or something close enough to it. The dragon looked at the bread, looked at him, the tail stilled. That is the answer, something in the rough voice that might have been skepticism, might have been something else. That's the whole answer, Darren said. You came to the door, you asked. Everything after that is just logistics. A long silence. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, a bird somewhere on the mountain was announcing itself to the post-storm world with the unreasonable confidence of something that had waited out the rain and was now extremely sure about its opinions. Humans kill dragons, the young dragon said, not an accusation. A statement of observed fact offered carefully, the way you offer a thing you believe to be true to someone who might dispute it, giving them the opportunity to respond. They do, Darren said, some of them, some of the time. You have killed dragons. This too was a statement, not a question. He wasn't sure how it knew or whether it was guessing, but there was a directness to it that suggested the creature was not interested in comfortable fictions and was willing to ask the uncomfortable questions that polite company usually avoided. He looked at the fire. Two, he said, both were burning villages. I was the person asked to stop them and I did what I was asked. A beat. I didn't enjoy it and I don't brag about it. The pale gold eyes processed this, the tail moved. And me, the dragon said. You were dying on my porch in the rain, Darren said. Those are different situations. I'm capable of knowing the difference between a dragon burning a village and a starving baby in a storm. The word baby landed in the space between them and Darren watched the dragon receive it. A small shift in the scales along the neck. A fractional change in posture that might have been indignation in a creature with more energy to spend on it. Not baby, the rough voice said, with as much dignity as it could carry. Young thens. A pause, the tail resumed its slow arc. Young, it agreed, in the tone of a concession given grudgingly to a reasonable alternative. Darren almost smiled. He'd almost smiled a handful of times in 4 years, and the feeling was as strange as it always was, the specific internal movement of a face that had gotten out of the habit. He didn't let it all the way out, saved it. Eat the bread, he said instead, and turned back toward the window. Behind him, after a moment, he heard the small, deliberate sounds of the bread being eaten. He made dinner as the light fell from the mountain and the cabin filled with the long gold shadows of late afternoon becoming evening. More venison, what was left of it, he'd need to hunt soon, though the storm had likely pushed the deer to lower ground and he'd have to go further than usual. Tubers from the cold box roasted near the fire, the last of the dried mushrooms. He set a second plate on the flagstone. The dragon ate beside him while he ate at his table, and the separation between them was practical rather than pointed. The blanket near the stove was where the creature was most comfortable, the table was where he ate, and neither of them was bothered by the arrangement. It was the companionable silence of two beings who had reached, through no particular negotiation, a mutual understanding that quiet was not the absence of communication. Darren ate and looked at the window and the night coming in behind it. He thought about the question the dragon had asked, why, and the answer he'd given it, which was true but was not the whole truth in the way that true things rarely are. The whole truth was longer than a sentence and he hadn't offered it because the creature hadn't asked for the whole truth, only for a reason, and because you knocked was a reason. The whole truth was that he had spent 20 years in the company of violence, and emerged from it with a very simple and absolute understanding of what he was, and was not willing to be responsible for. He was not willing to be the reason a thing that was asking for help didn't receive it. He was not willing to close a door on need because the need came from something unexpected or inconvenient or difficult. He had closed too many other doors in his life, made too many calculations about who or what deserved the extension of his effort, followed too many orders that told him this group of people over there. Those ones, they don't count, they're on the other side of the line, and he had done it. He had followed those orders and drawn those lines and told himself it was necessary, and some of it had been necessary and some of it had not been, and the distinction had left marks he still carried. So when something came to his door and asked with its last available resources for help, he helped. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe or wise or strategically sound, because he had decided somewhere in the quiet of 4 years on a mountain that this was who he was now. He didn't say any of this to the dragon. The dragon hadn't asked for the sermon, the dragon had asked for the reason. He'd given it the reasons. The rest was his own. That night, Darren Moss gave the dragon the old blanket to keep, rearranged the second wool covering from the chest at the foot of his bed onto his chair, and slept with the fire burning steady and the mountain silence pressing against the walls of the cabin and the small sounds of a recovering creature breathing beside the stove. He slept for the first time in a long time without waking up. In the morning, the pale gold eyes were already open and watching when he came back to himself, and the light coming through the shutter crack was the clear cold light of a world washed entirely clean, and the wood pile needed replenishing, and there was bread to make. The day begins. What battle-hardened men understand. The third morning arrived the way good things sometimes do, quietly, without announcement, as though it had simply always been there and was only now making itself visible. Darren woke before the light properly established itself, which was his habit, and had been since his first year of service when the sergeant above him had made it abundantly clear that soldiers who slept past dawn were soldiers who died at dawn. The habit had long outlasted the necessity, but he kept it anyway, the way he kept most of his habits, not out of sentimentality, but because a life organized by reliable patterns was a life that wasted less energy on uncertainty. He knew when he would wake, he knew what he would do when he woke. The variables of each day arranged themselves inside a structure that held, and the holding was a form of rest in itself. He lay in the dim cabin for a moment before moving, doing what he always did in that first 60 seconds of consciousness, listening. The silence outside had changed quality again. No rain, no wind, no storm pressing against the walls. The mountain silence was back, the real kind, the kind that had texture and depth to it, that wasn't the absence of sound so much as the presence of a particular stillness that the mountains generated on their own terms. He could hear very faintly the sound of water running somewhere down the slope. Snowmelt, probably, or one of the small channels that appeared after heavy rain and disappeared again as the ground absorbed what it could. And closer, the steady, unhurried breathing of the dragon near the stove. He turned his head and looked. It was awake, of course it was awake. He was beginning to understand that the creature was a light sleeper in the same way he was a light sleeper, which was to say it operated in a state of continuous low-level awareness even at rest, one eye always partly open, one ear always tracking. He'd noticed this the previous afternoon when he'd gotten up from his chair to add wood to the fire, and the dragon's eyes had opened before he'd taken a second step, tracking him with immediate focus rather than the slow surfacing of deep sleep. Another creature shaped by circumstances into something that didn't fully let go even when it was supposed to. The pale gold eyes met his across the dim cabin. He got up. The morning routine was the same as it always was, which was the point of routines. Water from the bucket. Fire rebuilt from last night's banked coals, which were still breathing quietly under their layer of ash, cooperative as old coals always were when they'd been treated with respect the night before. He set the pot on and crouched back on his heels and watched the wood catch with the specific satisfaction of a man who had learned to take genuine pleasure in small competencies. The dragon had moved itself closer to the fire at some point during the night. Not dramatically, it was still on the blanket, still in the corner he'd designated as its space, but the blanket had migrated perhaps 3 feet, which meant the dragon had shifted its own weight across the flagstone in the dark and taken the blanket with it. He noted this without remarking on it. The creature's ability to move itself was information about its recovery. He filed it. He made porridge. He'd been making porridge for himself for 4 years, and it was a thing he did well, dense and slightly sweet from the dried fruit he added in winter, properly salted, thick enough to sustain effort. He made more than he usually made and set a second portion in the wider bowl on the flagstone and went back to his own bowl at the table. The dragon ate. He could tell, watching from the side without being obvious about watching, that it was eating differently than it had the previous 2 days. Not the desperate, focused consumption of pure need. Not the careful, exploratory testing of a system still unsure whether it could trust what it was receiving. Something closer to appetite, something with decision in it. It ate at a pace that was its own rather than one dictated by recovery, pausing occasionally to look around the cabin, to track the light changing at the shutter, to examine some detail of the wall or the ceiling with the focused attention of a creature that was genuinely curious rather than merely alert to threats. The scales, Darren noted with quiet satisfaction, were looking substantially better. The storm cloud gray had fully returned to its living quality, the blue-silver beneath it catching even the low early morning light from the fire and doing something interesting with it. The visible bones of 2 days ago were receding, not gone but softened, the body filling back in around its own architecture. The wings, when the dragon stretched them, which it did now with some frequency, the unconscious physical optimism of a recovering body testing its own dimensions, showed the membrane filling out to something less fragile than the stretched cloth he'd seen on the porch. It was not well yet. A week, he estimated, before it was genuinely well. Maybe more. He knew enough about severe starvation in large animals to know that the internal work of recovery ran longer than the external signs of it, that the visible improvement arrived before the structural one, that a body could look significantly better than it was while it was still quietly rebuilding the foundations. But it was going to be well. He'd been sure of this since the second morning. He was more sure now. He went out after breakfast to split wood. The cold hit him as he opened the door, that sharp post-storm mountain cold that immediately established its opinion of human skin and left no ambiguity about those opinions. The sky above the tree line was the hard, clear blue of a clean world, and the light on the western face of the ridge had the quality of something freshly polished, each rock and bare tree limb picked out in a detail so precise it almost looked artificial. He could hear things again now that the rain had stopped. The distant water, closer and louder than the faint sound from inside the cabin, a raven somewhere above the tree line, making its declarative single-syllable announcements. The specific creak of cold wood settling against itself as the temperature shifted upward with the rising sun. He set the first log on the splitting block and swung. The axe was a good one, well-balanced. The handle replaced twice over 3 years as the wood wore, and he preferred to maintain it correctly rather than tolerate degradation. He'd sharpened the head 2 days before the storm, which had turned out to be good timing. The log split cleanly along the grain, and he set the halves aside and reached for the next one. He worked with the rhythmic economy of long practice, each swing placed rather than forced, the work going into the log and not into his arms and back because wasted effort was wasted effort regardless of where it happened. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. The bad knee registered its opinion about splitting wood in November cold, and he ignored it as usual. He was 3/4 through the pile when he heard a sound behind him. He finished the swing before he turned. Not from lack of interest, from the ingrained conviction that you completed the thing you were doing before you addressed the next thing, because half-finished actions were the beginning of half-finished habits. The dragon was in the doorway. Standing, on 4 legs properly weight-bearing, the body level and the head raised and the pale gold eyes forward in a way that said this was a choice rather than an effort. The wings were slightly spread, not for flight, just the small automatic counterbalancing adjustment of a creature upright on an unfamiliar surface, and the cold morning air was moving the thin membrane of them in a way that caught the light. It looked, for the first time since he'd found it on his porch, like what it was. Not a pile of starvation and bad luck held together by the last of its stubbornness. A dragon. Small yes, very young yes, with the proportional oversizedness of head and feet that marked creatures not yet grown into themselves. But structurally, unmistakably, fundamentally a dragon standing in the doorway of his cabin on a cold, clear November morning looking at him with eyes that had moved a long way from dying embers. They were properly gold now, not pale, not desperate. Gold the way a fire is gold when it's burning correctly with depth and movement in it, with something that looked remarkably like thought. Darren set the axe down against the splitting block. "You're standing," he said, in the same tone he always used, acknowledging facts without making performances of them. "Yes," the dragon said. The voice was still rough, still that quality of being calibrated for a larger instrument than the one currently producing it, but clearer than 2 days ago, more confident in its own use of the sounds it was making. "How does that feel?" A pause, the tail moved behind it in a single slow sweep. "Strange, better than not standing." "That's usually how it works," Darren said. He picked up the split logs and carried them to the covered stack near the cabin wall. "Don't stand too long. You're doing better, but better isn't done." The dragon watched him stack the wood with that considering gaze. "You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. He'd noticed the dragon doing this, presenting conclusions as statements rather than inquiries, offering them with a directness that was not rudeness but something closer to honesty. A preference for saying the thing it had already determined rather than asking permission to believe it. I was, Darren said. You speak like one, you move like one, a pause, you think like one. He looked over at it, what does that mean? The pale gold eyes met his steadily. You assess, always you look at a thing and you measure it, what it needs, what it can do, what it costs. Another pause, you measured me when you opened the door. He straightened from the wood pile and considered this. The dragon was not wrong, he had measured it. He'd done the assessment in the first seconds of seeing it, threat level, condition, likely outcome without intervention, the same rapid unconscious calculation he'd applied to every situation that mattered for 20 years. What surprised him was not that the dragon had noticed, but that it was telling him it had noticed. Offering the observation back to him with a specificity that said it had been thinking about this, turning it over, examining what it revealed. I did, he said. And you helped anyway, the dragon said, knowing what I am. Knowing what you were that night, Darren said, which wasn't much of anything dangerous. He picked up the remaining logs. Come inside, you'll get cold. They settled into a new configuration that day, different from the previous two. The dragon was mobile now in a limited and careful way, and it used this mobility with the deliberate intentionality of a creature that had spent time unable to move and was now very aware of the privilege of it. It moved around the cabin slowly, not restlessly. There was nothing anxious in it, none of the packing of a caged thing, but with the focused curiosity of something that was genuinely interested in understanding its environment. It examined the walls, the shelves, the tools hanging near the hearth, the books stacked on the low shelf beside the window, the equipment in the corner he used for maintenance and repair. It stopped at each thing for a measured amount of time and then moved on, systematic without being mechanical. Darren watched this from his chair without interfering. It stopped longest at the weapons. Not the axe which it had already seen in use. The other things, the items he'd brought from his previous life and hadn't been able to quite leave behind, the short sword on its pegs above the door, the knife on his belt that had been with him for 15 years, the dented and repaired brigandine hanging on its wooden form in the corner like a headless soldier standing permanent watch. The dragon looked at these things for a long time, the tail stilled, the wings folded tight, and then it looked at him. You have fought many things, it said. Many things, he agreed. And now you are here. A gesture with the head, a dip and rise that he'd begun to read as a dragon's version of indicating the immediate surroundings. Alone, on the mountain. Now I'm here. The pale gold eyes were steady on him. Why? The same word it had used 2 days ago, but asking something different now. Then it had been asking about the specific act. Now it was asking about the life, the whole shape of it. Why the cabin, why the mountain, why the deliberate separation from the world that had contained 20 years of him? Darren was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding the question, considering how much of the true answer was useful to give a creature that was still recovering and might not need the full weight of it, and deciding, based on 2 days of observation, that this particular creature could carry more than he'd have initially assumed. Because I was tired, he said. Because I'd spent a very long time doing things I was told were necessary and found out eventually that necessary and right aren't always the same thing. And because quiet seemed like the thing I'd used up most and needed back. The dragon absorbed this. You are not at peace. He looked at it. What makes you say that? Peace looks different than this. The tail moved. You are, it paused, working through its vocabulary for the right shape. Resting, you are a soldier who has stopped fighting and is resting, but the fighting is still in you, it has not left. Darren held the pale gold gaze for a long moment. No, he said finally, it hasn't. That is not a bad thing, the dragon said, with the firm directness of a creature that had made a determination and was presenting it as settled. The fighting being in you is why you opened the door. He sat with this for a moment. Then he nodded, once the minimal acknowledgement he gave to things that were correct and didn't require embellishment. He got up to make tea. The days fell into a shape. Not a rigid one, he'd had enough of rigidity, enough of schedules imposed from outside that organized a man's hours without reference to what the hours actually contained. But a comfortable one, the natural organization that emerges when two beings sharing a space figure out their respective rhythms and stop colliding with each other. Darren woke before dawn and rebuilt the fire and made tea while the world outside assembled itself back into visibility. The dragon woke shortly after, the pale gold eyes finding him with immediate focus in the dark of the cabin, and lay quiet and watchful while he moved through his morning in his particular unhurried way. He made food for both of them. He tended the chickens, whose opinion of the new arrangement in the cabin was expressed through the heightened suspicion they brought to his morning visits to the coop. They could smell it, he supposed, or had some avian intuition about the presence of something large and predatory nearby, and he couldn't entirely blame them. He split wood, repaired things that needed repairing, walked the perimeter of his small holding in the cold, clear air. The dragon joined him on the third morning. Walked beside him at a careful pace that matched his own, the claws clicking quietly on the frozen ground, the wings adjusted against the cold. It said very little on these walks, which suited him perfectly. It looked at things with those considering eyes, occasionally stopping to examine something more closely. A track in the remaining mud, the way ice had formed in the hollow of a rock. A pinecone examined with a thoroughness that suggested the taxonomy of unfamiliar objects mattered to it, and then moving on when it had decided it understood whatever it was looking at. He began to understand the shape of this creature's intelligence, which was not the intelligence of books or accumulated information, but the intelligence of keen and patient observation. It watched things until it understood them. It asked questions only when observation had run out. It did not pretend to know things it didn't know, and it did not perform ignorance about things it had already figured out. When it was uncertain, it said so, directly and without embarrassment. When it had reached a conclusion, it presented the conclusion. And if the conclusion was challenged, it either updated it or defended it depending on the quality of the challenge. It reminded him, in ways he hadn't expected and didn't entirely have language for, of the best officers he'd served under. The ones who had lasted. The ones who had brought their people through things that shouldn't have been survivable. On the sixth day, the dragon told him its name. They were sitting near the fire in the evening, the cabin settled into its night configuration, the light low and orange and the world outside completely dark and very still. Darren had been working on the repair of a leather strap from his pack, and the dragon had been watching him work with the same attention it brought to everything, and the silence between them had the particular quality it had developed over nearly a week of shared evenings. Not empty, not uncomfortable, filled with the mutual awareness of two beings at ease with their own company and each other's. "My name," the dragon said without preamble, "is not possible in your language." "I know," Darren said. He didn't stop working the leather. "But there is a—" It paused. The tail moved in its thinking arc. A sound at the center of it, a part that carries the meaning. It produced the sound then, and he felt it as much as heard it, that gravel slide and deep resonant hum that he'd labeled privately days ago, but given now with more precision, more intention, with the specific quality of a thing being offered rather than simply made. He sat with it for a moment, feeling the resonance of it settle. "The closest thing in my language," he said carefully, "is something like Soreth." He paused. "If that's too far from the original, tell me." The dragon considered this with its head slightly tilted. "It loses things," it said, "but what it keeps is the part that matters." A pause. "Soreth." "Soreth," he repeated. And that was that. No ceremony, no formal announcement. The kind of nomming that happens between two beings who have already spent enough time together that a name is simply the last administrative detail settling into place. On the seventh morning, Darren woke to find the dragon standing at the open door. He'd left the shutter unlatched the previous evening and the door had come open in the night. And Soreth was standing at the threshold looking out at the mountain with an expression. He could read the expressions now, had built a working vocabulary of posture and eye and tail that was not restless, not desperate, not sad. Thoughtful. The expression of a creature that had reached a conclusion and was taking a moment to look at it clearly before acting on it. The sky beyond the doorway was the particular pale gray of very early morning, the darkness not quite finished and the light not yet committed, everything suspended in the honest ambiguity of the moment between. The mountains were shapes against it, massive and permanent and utterly indifferent the way mountains were. The air coming in was cold and carried the smell of high altitude and pine, and very faintly the approach of something warmer moving in from the south. Darren got up from his chair and stood beside the dragon in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The sky lightened by increments. The shapes of the mountains became more specific. Below the tree line, something moved, probably deer, finding their way back to higher ground now that the storm had passed. The raven was back on its ridge, making its morning announcements to an audience of general indifference. "You need to find your clutch," Darren said. Not a question. Not a suggestion. A fact he'd known was coming and was presenting now because it was the right time for it, and he'd never been a man who delayed the honest thing in favor of the comfortable one. "Yes," Soreth said. "You're strong enough to travel, not indefinitely, but enough." He looked at the sky. "The weather's going to hold another 4 or 5 days. There's a pass on the north face that opens up after the storm rain drains off. Better route than the south way if you're heading toward the high nesting grounds." The pale gold eyes turned to look at him. something in them that he'd learned to read as attention sharpened into something else, something that had taken him longer to identify and that he still didn't entirely have a name for. Depth, maybe, the quality of being seen and knowing it. You know the mountain, Soreth said. I've walked most of it. You could come, pause, the tale was still. I said this before, you did not answer. He looked out at the mountains, at the sky lightening over them, at the cold and clean and difficult world that extended in every direction from this specific point. He thought about the pass on the north face and the high ground above it, and the particular quality of silence that existed at altitude above the tree line, where the world reduced itself to wind and stone, and the very specific sensation of being a small and warm thing in a large and cold place, and finding that the smallness was not a problem. He thought about 4 years of a mountain that had been his and nobody else's. He thought about the fact that something had come to his door and asked for help and he'd let it in and fed it and watched it recover and listened to it think, and that the cabin in this past week had contained something it hadn't contained in 4 years, and he had a word for that now that he hadn't had when it started. Company, the real kind, not proximity, company. I'll think about it, he said. Soreth regarded him. You are already thinking about it. You have been thinking about it for 3 days. He looked at the dragons. The dragon looked back at him with those gold eyes that had seen everything he'd done in the past week, and filed it away and drawn conclusions from it with the patient methodical intelligence that had never stopped working. Not once. Not even on the first night when the rest of the system was barely keeping the lights on. He almost smiled. He let it get further this time before he contained it. I have been thinking about it for 3 days, he confirmed. And he looked back at the mountains, at the pass on the north face, at the sky that was now definitely committing to morning, the gray pulling back from the east with the slow certainty of something that had been planning this for hours. Give me an hour, he said. I need to close up the cabin. He did it in 45 minutes. He was a man who knew what he needed and did not take what he didn't need, and this knowledge made packing efficient. The pack came down from its peg. The bedroll, the fire kit, the field rations he kept always prepared and always restocked, the small tool kit in its oilskin wrap, the knife on his belt. The short sword above the door, considered for a moment, set back on its pegs. Too heavy for what this was, and he'd come to believe over 4 years that a man carrying weapons he didn't expect to use was carrying a story he was still telling himself about what kind of situation he was in. He banked the fire so the coals would survive 3 days. He checked the chickens, left them extra feed, latched the coop against foxes with the secondary latch he usually didn't bother with. He pulled the door of the cabin shut and wedged it in the way he always did when he left for more than a day, a specific piece of shaped wood that held the latch while allowing pressure to build against rain and wind. He stood outside the shut door for a moment with the pack on his back and the cold air against his face, and the morning fully arrived around him, yellow and clean and very precise. Soreth was waiting at the edge of the clearing, standing with a patience that had always been there even at the beginning underneath everything else, that fundamental quality of a creature that understood that time spent waiting productively was not time wasted. The scales were catching the morning light and doing what he'd known they would do in proper illumination, the storm gray shifting and shimmering, the silver blue underneath coming through in pulses as the dragon breathed and the light moved. It looked in the honest clarity of morning extraordinary. Not the word he usually used for things, but the accurate one. Darren walked across the clearing and stopped beside it. North Face Pass, he said, I know the approach. Weather will hold if we move in the next 2 hours. Soreth looked at him, looked at the pack, looked back at his face with those gold eyes that were doing the thing they always did now, not the desperate focus of the first night, not the wary assessment of the second day, but the steady and considering attention of a creature that had decided something about him some days ago and was simply confirming that its decision remained correct. Thank you, Soreth said, for the door. The words landed the same way they always landed when they were simple and true, and said without decoration. Darren looked at the dragon for a moment, at the mountains behind it, at the morning light on both of them, indiscriminate and clear. Thank you, he said quietly, for knocking. And then he adjusted the pack on his shoulders, checked the position of the sun, and started toward the North Face Trail with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man who knew the terrain and had nowhere to be except where he was going. Soreth walked beside him. The morning opened ahead of them, cold and real and full of mountain, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Some things were simply what they were. The door had been opened, the road was ahead. That was enough.